The dragon ships! The dragon ships are coming! The Norsemen are here! Oh, shock horror. In the 9th and 10th centuries, that cry would have caused instant panic among the population of any town or village in Britain, Ireland, Scotland, or Francia. Indeed, just about anywhere else in the world. It would have been like turning on the light and seeing the cockroaches scatter in all directions. It gave rise to the saying, "From the fury of the Norsemen, good Lord, deliver us." Now, no one would have said, "The Vikings are coming." No, since nobody at that time actually called them that. Even the Vikings didn't call themselves Vikings. Mainly because they weren't Vikings. No, the Vikings were not Vikings. Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales. Now, say Viking, and what springs to mind instantly, as far as most of the general public are concerned? Raiding. Yes, big, scruffy, unkept brutes wearing helmets with horns sticking out of them, leaping off ships that had fearsome-looking dragon heads on them, and looting, burning, and raping indiscriminately, laughing as they committed evil deeds with a savage ferocity, reaching positively epic levels of barbarism unknown before or since. Oh, yes, so evil. Well, that image, popular and widespread though it may be, well, it just doesn't fit the historic profile, as many things do not. Talk about not fitting the picture. This helmet actually in itself disproves a common Viking myth. No, not the fact that Vikings never wore horned helmets, but rather the idea that they wore helmets at all. But, you say, if that's a Viking helmet, then Vikings wore helmets, right? No, not quite. And incidentally, helmets were often worn with what became known as an arming cap underneath, because they weren't really all that terribly comfortable. You see, the popular idea is of dozens of men leaping from a longship, every one of them fully armoured and wearing a helmet. Now, this is quite a good reproduction of a helmet found in 1943 in Buskerud, Norway. And it is one of just a very, very tiny number of helmets ever found from the Viking Age. Among them 2 fragments from Gotland and another fragment from Kiev. The number even of helmet fragments can be counted on one hand. So, if every Viking wore a helmet, why do we never find them? Go to Greece, and you can see literally dozens and dozens of Corinthian helmets on shelves in museums. Hundreds of them, literally just stacks and stacks of the things. Some of them still had people's skulls in them. There's hundreds of them. So we can say Greek soldiers wore helmets. Well, they're the helmets. They're all over the place. But Norse warrior graves never contain a helmet. Swords, shields, axes, arrows, yes, but helmets, no. If a warrior was buried with his weapons, would not his helmet be included? There are over 30 graves of women buried with weapons, many clearly military weapons. But again, not a helmet to be seen. Where are they? Where did they go? This is very clear evidence that helmets, which would have been expensive, remember, were actually worn by very, very few men, probably only kings and jarls and their household troops, the housecarls, but not by the rank and file. So the helmeted Viking raiders are probably just as wrong as the horned helmet idea. And that's something I'll be talking about shortly. Real Vikings weren't scruffy. They were exceedingly clean and well-groomed, being the cleanest people in Europe in those generally unwashed and no doubt rather smelly days. They didn't wear horned helmets, and they were very little different to anyone else at the time when it came to brutality, though they were adept at using it to instill fear in their opponents and thus obtain their objectives with as little loss to themselves as possible. Since if your enemy runs away in terror and doesn't stop to fight, well, it makes victory a great deal easier. It becomes a walkover rather than a battle. They hardly ever surpassed the very methodical, strictly controlled, and very deliberate savagery of a Roman legion, for example, whose usual orders were to kill everything living in their path, human and animal, until an officer told them to stop. Nor did the Vikings even come close to the atrocities committed by the supposedly noble crusaders of later centuries, and the Spanish Inquisition, well, that left them very definitely in second place. Probably in third place, actually. As indeed did many of the activities of the conquistadors in the New World. In our own times, so-called ethnic cleansing, well, it's a nice way of saying killing everything you don't like. It sounds nice. That went far beyond the most brutal efforts of the Vikings, who had no interest in wiping out a population, merely terrifying them, which they had very good reason to do, since it made their activities that much easier. But, of course, raiding and the considerable brutality that obviously went with it was a significant part of the Vikings, since, in fact, even to be a Viking, rather than just a Dane, a Swede, or a Norwegian, one had to go out raiding, or at least do something elsewhere. Given the fact that the word Viking, or Vikingr in Old Norse, meant to get in a ship, to go somewhere, do something or other when they got there. It could be seen as meaning a raider, a pirate, a seafarer, an adventurer. The exact definition is a bit vague, but you could generally say it meant getting in a ship and going from here to there and doing something there. As long as you stayed in Scandinavia and didn't get in a ship, you weren't a Viking. And even had you gone off raiding or whatever else and thus become a Viking, as soon as you set foot back in Scandinavia, you were no longer a Viking. Your Vikingness stayed in the ship. Now, being a Viking didn't mean you had to do nothing but raid and kill people and rape things. It could simply have involved trading with the natives in another country, as was often the case. It could be establishing a settlement, as was frequently done later on. Ireland being a fine example of that, with most of the major towns founded by the Vikings, not by the native Irish. And as I've said, they were not called Vikings in their own time. They were, I'm sure, called quite a lot of things, many of them very obscene. But Viking wasn't a term of nationality. It referred specifically to going off in a ship. One couldn't be a Viking, but one could go Viking, something the peoples of other lands wouldn't even have known about. Terms such as Northmen, heathens, Danes, Norsemen, pagans, and the like were used to describe them, but Viking didn't even come into use in English until centuries after the last longship had rotted away to dust. But the word has come today to mean the Norse people as a whole and anything and everything associated with them. But it was never used by the Norse themselves, save in that very, very limited seaborne context. They might have said, "I'm going Vikingr," but they would never have said, "I'm Vikingr." No, they'd have said, "Well, I'm a Dane, I'm a Swede, or I'm a Norwegian." But raiding was the principal activity of many of those who went Vikingr, at least in the early days. And even in later times of settlements and increasing trade, raids still occurred. And the so-called Viking Age is itself dated from their first major raid abroad. Not the actual first, there have been one or two very minor ones, but their first really significant raid, one that terrified the Anglo-Saxons and set the stage for what was to come for several centuries. That was the raid on the monastic settlement on the island of Lindisfarne, or Lindisfarne as we know it today, in the Kingdom of Northumbria in England, during June of 793 AD, considered as the true start of the Viking Age. And it ends in 1066 with the death of King Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Now, I should point out that there are differing dates used for the Viking Age. Some people quote 750 AD or even earlier, right back perhaps to 700 AD, based on recent discoveries of ships in Estonia. Others say 800, and they extend it to the year 1100. But for now, I'll go with the 793 to 1066. That's the easy one, so we'll stick with that. The pre-Viking Age period, known as the Vendel era, is also dated differently depending on who you consult. Some give 550 to 793, others say 500 to 800, overlapping the Viking Age. So whichever one you use, well, you'll still be wrong by another one. Take your choice. And Viking raids on England, of course, still occurred from time to time for years after 1066. King Harold's death didn't end the raids, as if by magic, instantly, click, all raids are now gone. So even that date could be questioned. The first Norse incursion in England wasn't actually a raid. It was more of what we might call a limited occupation. And it occurred in 789 AD, when 3 ships landed on the coast of Wessex, the Norsemen demanding tolls from passing ships, and voluntary contributions, I'm sure, from the local English. And it is very easy to volunteer a contribution if the person asking for it has a great big axe in their hand at the time. The English king, Beorhtric of Wessex, sent his bailiff, a man called Bidehud, to find out who these people were and why they hadn't declared their intentions, and principally, why the hell they were collecting taxes that he should be collecting. That did not really please him very much, but the encounter didn't really go very well, and the king's bailiff and his men were all killed, the Norsemen withdrawing soon after. I think that incident was actually used in an episode of the TV show Vikings, if I remember correctly. So you could reasonably date the Viking Age from 789 if you wanted to, but as I said, it wasn't a raid as such, because a raid is get in, get what you want, and get the hell out of there as fast as you can. You don't hang around. The ability to carry out raids, as well as the considerable trading and the establishment of settlements right across Europe and out to distant places like Iceland and Greenland, and even further to Newfoundland and New Brunswick in North America, was totally the result of one thing: the longship. Without the famous Viking longship and the navigational skills developed by the men who sailed in them, history would never have heard of the Vikings. Well, because there would never have been any Vikings to hear of. They were the product of their amazing ships. Ships that could ride high in the water, skimming over the sea rather than ploughing through it, and able to weather storms that would have sunk other craft, sail up shallow rivers due to their low draft, and travel at a tremendous speed for those days. Faster, in fact, than many later steamships, with an average speed of up to 10 knots, which is over 11 miles per hour. And achieving maximum speeds considerably greater than that, depending on the sea conditions, the strength and direction of the wind, and the rowing ability of the crew, where the oars being used as well as the sails and so on. After they discovered the wealth that could be obtained from raiding, not to mention slaves, raids like the one at Lindisfarne became commonplace and set the image of the Vikings in popular culture, despite their considerable achievements in other fields. But yeah, that's understandable, of course. If someone had just burned down your village, killed some people, raped a few, and taken everything of value that you had with them, you probably wouldn't be overly interested nor appreciative of other aspects of their culture. You wouldn't have cared if they sniffed flowers, wrote poems, and petted kittens. It really wouldn't have really bothered you in the slightest. Raids could be undertaken, of course, by only 2 or 3 ships, or they could involve large fleets. 60 longships sailing up the rivers Liffey and Boyne here in Ireland on one occasion, and fleets of over 100 or more were not uncommon. Of course, the more ships, well, the more men. So very small raiding parties would have confined their attacks to not very well defended villages or monastic settlements and churches that would have offered very little by way of resistance, apart from possibly being preyed at by some angry monks. Attacks on large towns or heavily defended sites would have been left, obviously, to the bigger fleets. And to begin with, most of the countries of Europe seem not to have considered any risks from the sea. Their defences were geared to repelling attacks by a land army. That most of their defences pointed landwards, not seawards. They weren't really bothered about seaborne attackers, probably because there really hadn't been any up to that time, something which the Vikings took full advantage of in the early raids. Of course, the countries of Europe later on certainly did something about that. Surprise and speed were an integral part of Viking raids. Their ships coming in out of the blue, as the saying goes, often dropping their sails to make themselves less visible until it was too late, and rowing quickly in to land on the nearest beach, the very sight of them causing panic among the townspeople, many of whom would grab anything they could carry and run for their lives, thus reducing any likely resistance for the raiders. The Vikings would move very swiftly, taking whatever they could easily carry by way of gold, silver, precious jewels, utensils, weapons, anything that was either of value or useful. Of course, most of the really valuable things were to be found in the churches and the monasteries, rather than in the houses of ordinary people. That is where the gold chalices, the crucifixes, and other religious symbols, frequently decorated with precious jewels, were to be had. Rich fabrics, often themselves decorated with jewels, as well as silver and gold coins, offering from wealthy people to the church to ensure a good front seat in heaven. Offering sometimes from ordinary folk as well. Half a penny given to the church to get one a better place in the next world. Well, that was a penny well spent. And the bishops, the archbishops, they often had more wealth than the jarl, than the thanes or the kings that they served. The bishop's palace would often be a much better place to go to than perhaps the palace of the local king. The Vikings would return to their ships as quickly as possible, perhaps taking some captives with them. Women, of course, were frequently taken, and monks or priests were very valuable captives, being among the very few people in those days who could read or write, so they'd fetch a good price at the slave market. A quick departure gave the local chieftains insufficient time to raise a force strong enough to attack the Vikings. By the time messengers on horseback had carried news of the raid to the local thane or ealdorman, and an armed force had been assembled and arrived on the scene, well, the longships would be far out to sea, and with no ships of equal speed to pursue, there was very little that could be done about it. Part of the reason for these fast hit-and-run tactics was that the Vikings didn't take unnecessary risks, since while they were brave and seemingly fearless in battle, possibly the most fearless warriors of the early Middle Ages, they wouldn't risk losing any more men than they could help, which was sensible. They didn't fight in order just to show how brave they were when they were on a raid. They fought to gain something, which meant taking as few losses as possible, especially if you only had 2 or 3 ships. For example, lose 5 men. Might not seem like a great loss in military terms, but that was 5 less men to row. That could impede the efficiency of the ship, as well as reducing their effectiveness on the next raid. Lose any more, and it might mean having to turn for home, with less profits than had been intended. Vikings only attacked when the chance of victory was good. They didn't make foolhardy charges against huge odds just to show how brave they were. That achieved nothing, other than perhaps a very nice funeral. If you went Vikingr, it was to obtain something, be it silver or women or whatever else you wanted. And if you were dead, well, you couldn't really enjoy the spoils of your raid. Now, the frequency of raids directed at religious institutions, churches, monasteries, nunneries, and the like, led to the popular belief that the Vikings hated Christianity. Oh, yes, they wanted to destroy the faith completely, wipe it from the face of the earth. Well, they didn't. They weren't really all that interested in Christianity as such. Now, they would have considered it very weak and rather spineless, despising its seeming lack of assertiveness. Neither they themselves nor their own gods would have turned the other cheek and loved thy neighbour who just wronged them, as the Christian idea was. Now, the Vikings would have considered the gods of Osgard, or Asgard, as it is in English, superior to the god of the weak, love everything god of the Christians, but and there were instances where a Viking leader would offer a sacrifice to Odin on the altar of a Christian church, just to make that point, as they did in Ireland, at Armagh, for example, just as with the Romans in earlier times, for that matter. That was a statement. Look, I have honoured Odin on the Christian altar, but has lightning struck me down? No. You see, it was symbolic. But apart from that, they didn't really care what gods other people wanted to worship. Unlike the Christians, they never attempted to convert others to their own faith. They didn't send out missionaries to convert people of other faiths. They weren't really interested in other gods, just as long as nobody tried to make them worship those other gods by force. No, that usually did not end well. As I've said, much of the wealth of those times was in the hands of the church. So church property was where a Viking raider would go to get it. He wouldn't raid a penniless fishing village and go home with a few baskets of fish and a couple of women who probably smelled very strongly of fish, when there was a wealthy monastery nearby, full of gold and silver and all those lovely things. If all the wealth had been in the possession of some other religious faith, the Vikings would have raided them. They would have just walked straight past the Christian church. And we would now be saying, just as incorrectly, that they hated those other religions and wanted to wipe them off the face of the earth. I suppose most people would consider the Vikings to have been better armoured and possessing superior quality weapons than those of the peoples they so easily seem to overcome. But that isn't the case. No. For a start, there's a difference between a full-time professional soldier and a warrior. And Viking raiders were not professional soldiers, highly trained and well-armed and equipped men whose sole duty was fighting and paid to do it. There were professional soldiers in Scandinavia, well-trained, armoured, and armed with swords, spears, and axes, but they were the personal household troops of the jarls and the kings and the other important nobles, although they were garrisons assigned to protect forts or harbours. They didn't go off raiding in longships. No, they would only have gone on a Viking raid had the king they served been going on the raid, and kings didn't usually go and do that themselves. On occasions, such as when Harald Hardrada sailed to England in 1066, for example, his household troops, yes, they would have gone with him, but otherwise they stayed in Scandinavia. Most of the Viking raiders were part-time raiders, you might say, being farmers and fishermen, labourers or goat herds or whatever else their actual profession might be, going Viking in search of wealth and glory when opportunity presented itself, usually in the summer when the weather was good. Raiding wasn't their profession, nor, as I've said, were they professional soldiers, though each man could be considered a great warrior, and their fighting ability was equal to and frequently better than many professionals in other lands. But one great difference would be that they would not generally have been as well equipped as were the professional soldiers. They relied on their fighting ability, their ferocity, their courage to overcome what would actually have been a lack of equal weaponry to the professionals. Many men would not have worn helmets. I've touched on that. Most of them, in fact, as I've already mentioned, nor would they have worn armour. Padded burnies or boiled leather armour would have been more common than chainmail, which would have been the prerogative of the wealthy warriors or the nobles, as would helmets and swords. These things were expensive, and the average man, he couldn't afford them. So while important warriors or jarls would have been fully armoured with helmets and chainmail, the average man would actually be no better protected in battle than would have been the case with the majority of the Franks or the Anglo-Saxons, both of whom had a similar military structure. Household soldiers who would have worn helmets and chainmail, backed up by the local militia, the Fyrd, as it was called in England, largely composed of able-bodied farmers and labourers armed with a variety of military and non-military weapons. And dressed as they would be doing their normal everyday tasks. Most of them, you wouldn't have known that they were actually warriors going to war if they hadn't had a weapon in their hand, because they would have looked just the same as they did ploughing a field, planting crops, or fixing a boat. Now, any man who killed an enemy, well, of course, he could take the dead man's equipment. So on every raid, there might have been one or two men who acquired some armour or a helmet from a fallen opponent, if they were lucky enough to kill an armoured adversary rather than just members of the Fyrd or local men who'd grabbed a weapon. But the image of every Viking being fully armoured, wearing a helmet, head to foot in chainmail and carrying a fancy shield, well, it isn't really correct. Shields would be very much the same as helmets, swords, and other things. It's very unlikely that your average farmer or goat herd or whatever would have one of those lovely shields with some nice design on it. Why would he? He might take one off a dead adversary, of course, but the Viking weapons weren't any better than those of their opponents as a rule. And in fact, a lot of swords made in Francia were actually of superior quality to some of those produced in Scandinavia. Some swords carried by the Vikings now were superb, of course. The Ulfberht swords, for example, made of crucible steel, the metal far ahead of its time in quality, and often it's a puzzle actually how they produced it, because they didn't really have the ability to make the temperatures required, but they did. But not all of them were like that. And in any case, they would have been carried only by the most prominent or wealthy warriors and the nobles, because they would have been even more expensive than your ordinary common or garden sword. So the Vikings were always keen to acquire Frankish weapons, if they could. One advantage they did have to begin with was the axe, seen more as a tool for woodworking than as a military weapon in the rest of Europe at that time of the first Viking raids, but they made it into a fearsome weapon of war. Some of their axes having shafts 4 feet long, the Daneaxe, as they were called. And the impetus of that thing, the kinetic energy when it was swung, it would just basically, it would chop you in half. Others were designed for throwing. Though even there, the initial advantage that gave them was lost as other countries began, to use special war axes themselves. So it's fair to say that Viking raiders were often no better and sometimes not as well equipped as their adversaries. No better protected. But the fighting spirit of the Vikings, that I suppose is what really gave them the advantage. They had a ferocity and sometimes a religious drive to their ferocity other people did not have. See, when you're faced with a man who is forced to fight you and will probably die, so that now his greatest ambition is to gain honor and glory rather than the spoils of wealth or women, his most cherished desire now is to die in battle, with a weapon in his hand, and be carried aloft by mounted warrior maidens, the Valkyrie, or Valkyries as we call them, to feast with the gods in Valhall. Well, you're at a tremendous disadvantage. Take away the fear of death, replace it with an actual desire for a glorious death in battle, and you have the most dangerous warrior it's possible to meet. He has no fear. He won't run away because there's more of you than there are of him. There's 10 of you, there's 1 of him. He doesn't care. He doesn't care if he's outnumbered once he is committed to battle. Now, he may avoid a very one-sided fight to begin with. He won't foolishly rush into a dangerous situation, since his primary intention is to return home with his captured wealth, which he can't do, as I've said, when he's dead. And as I've said, the Vikings always weighed up any possible, excessive risks that they might face. But once being in battle, he becomes unstoppable. If death is the alternative, well, that's what he wants. He doesn't care. If you don't kill him, he is going to kill you. He won't back off. The Christian Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, or the Celtic Irish, they didn't have that kind of religious fervour. No, I mean, while they hoped for a reward in heaven, yes, it wasn't dependent on getting themselves heroically killed in battle and dying with a weapon in the hand. It was more related to a lot of praying and attendance at Mass, a great deal of praying, giving money to the church, and so on. If they could gain salvation without getting their head bashed in with an axe, well, that's the course they would choose. But a Viking in battle, well, he was longing for that axe or sword to send him to Valhall to feast with the gods. The Native Americans had a very similar attitude. While they avoided a fight unless they were confident of an easy victory with as little loss as possible, no, they didn't ride around circled covered wagons being shot off their horses. That's pure Hollywood. They weren't stupid enough to do that. But once they were committed to battle, their attitude became, today is a good day to die. A Viking would have agreed with them. They probably would have got on quite well. The first proper raid on England came 4 years after that encounter with the King's Bailiff at Lindisfarne in 793 AD, and it caused a wave of fear across the land, since pagans, evil pagans, had desecrated a much venerated holy place, the monastery having contained the well-known shrine of St. Cuthbert, without any apparent retribution from God. No lightning bolts struck them down, no storm sank their ships. And in those superstitious times, people would have seen the Norsemen as a possible punishment from God, a punishment from some sins they had committed or a religious duty they had omitted. And God had sent these evil heathens to punish them for it. In 794, the Vikings descended on Jarrow Abbey, and the following year they sacked Iona Abbey in Scotland. They raided it again in 802 and destroyed it in 806, killing some 68 people who resided there. The survivors abandoning the site and moving to Kells in Ireland, which probably seemed a much safer location. It wasn't. Ironically, it was one of the monasteries raided by the Vikings in Ireland. In fact, virtually every important monastic site in Ireland was raided at one time or another, even those far inland, given the longship's ability to sail up a shallow river with a depth of more than 3 feet. The first major raid along the south coast of England occurred in 835 when the Isle of Sheppey was attacked, and in time fleets of Viking ships would raid all along the English coast with, seeming impunity, since the Anglo-Saxons had no navy to oppose them to begin with. It wasn't until much later, in the time of Alfred the Great, that the Saxons began to construct anything that could actually be considered as a navy. Eventually, after decades of intermittent and generally ineffectual conflict, the Saxons decided to pay the Vikings to go away, the so-called Danegeld, since it was mainly Danes who occupied the east of England. Yeah, that seemed a good idea. Yeah, they want silver, so give them silver, they'll go away. Yeah, brilliant. There was only one flaw with it. It didn't work. It was perhaps one of the most stupid decisions in history, and it did exactly the opposite of what it was intended to do, that is, get rid of the Viking threat. Can you imagine if banks handed out money to criminals not to rob them? We'd have long lines of would-be bank robbers outside every bank. I wants me money. But we gave you the no-rob money yesterday. Yeah, right, but I wants it again, I do. And I brought me sawn off 12 gauge, just in case you got any objections to that. You got any objections? No problem, sir. There's your money. Yeah, thank you. Do call again. Yes, that wouldn't go down very well, would it? The Danegeld had exactly the same result. All it did was bring the Vikings back, time and time and time again, eager to receive silver without having to fight for it, and getting more than they would have got had they fought. Thousands of pounds of silver was now routinely paid to them, vastly more than any number of raids would have produced. And of course the Vikings just kept coming back. There's a runestone in Scandinavia that records one Viking who received 3 Danegeld payments, probably getting far more each time than he could have obtained in raids and not losing a single man to do it. Why wouldn't he keep going back? As we would say today, he knew a sucker when he saw one. And failure to pay had serious repercussions, like having one's nose slit open as a sign to others that prompt payment was a very good idea, which incidentally is where the saying paying through the nose originates. Ironically, these payments eventually led to all of England being ruled by a Norseman. Yes, the great King Knute, who ascended the throne in 1016. His rule largely made possible by all the Danegeld that he had been given and used it to pay his army. And one of the finest kings, incidentally, who ever ruled in pre-Norman England. After a 30-year Norse rule of the united England, Knute's royal line came to an end. Saxon kings ruled once more and would continue to do so until the country fell to Duke William of Normandy in 1066. Himself, of course, a descendant of Rolf, or Rollo as he's usually called, the leader of Vikings who had settled in Francia. So when Duke William arrived, he could quite truthfully have said, "Hey guys, we're back." By 795 AD, it was Ireland's turn to receive an initial visit from the dragon ships. And by 798, the east coast of Ireland was becoming a rather dangerous place to be, especially if you happened to have anything worth taking. Within a few years, the west of Ireland was being raided, Galway, Sligo, and the Skellig Islands being hit very hard. And these raids continued for decades. Large numbers of women were taken from Howth in Dublin Bay in 821 to be sold as slaves, and a large fleet of longships sailed up the River Boyne in 837. Now, it's been widely believed that Irish monks built tall towers known as round towers, which were basically like a big chimney with a pointy top on it, to protect themselves against Viking raiders. The towers have an entrance doorway high above the ground, usually about 10 feet, and reached by a ladder, into which they would take whatever valuables they could grab and run when the Vikings were spotted, pull up the ladder, and hide in the tower till the raiders left, basically going to the Vikings. Yeah, but that may not be quite accurate. Given the fact that the Irish word for them actually meant bell house, and that the Vikings could simply bring a ladder, after all, to reach the doorway once they realized what the monks were doing, it is now thought more likely that the towers were simply, belfries, like their name implies, which could, of course, be used as a refuge, though not actually intended for that purpose. But would they really have been a safe refuge? If they were tall, narrow structures, it would become little more than giant chimneys should anyone access the lower floor and start a fire, thereby forcing those on the floors above to come out. And if Viking raiders knew that a great deal of wealth, the very thing that they had come for, was somewhere in that tower, would they not have every incentive to get into it? Something they wouldn't have if the monks hadn't taken the valuables in there in the first place. All they needed would be a ladder. That's very easy to carry on a ship, just lash it to the mast, and some kindling to start a fire. All things considered, it seems highly unlikely that the famous round towers were ever intended for defence. Even if they had been used as such on some occasions, I suppose monks would be safer in them than they would have been outside. But would they have left the valuables outside before they retreated into the towers, giving the Vikings no reason to follow them? As I see it, if I were a Viking leader and I know that in that tower is the very thing that I have just crossed the North Sea to get, I'm getting into that tower and I don't care if I have to dig under it, go through it, bring a ladder and smash in the door, or whatever I have to do. I am getting into that tower. But if, oh look, they left all the lovely silver and gold and everything right here on the ground. Okay, thank you very much. Bye, monks. And I'm going. And I think that does, put a new perspective on the whole round tower thing. After years of quick hit-and-run raids, the Norsemen began not just to raid and run, but to remain for extended periods, camping at Loch Ness over the winter of 840 to 841, as well as founding a permanent settlement on the river Liffey, which they called Dyfflin, the name deriving from the Irish Dubh Linn, meaning the dark pool, where they spent the following winter, which would later become the city of Dublin. And by the year 914 AD, intensive Norse settlement, rather than just raiding, had begun. Some of these settlements going on to become the major towns of Ireland, such as Limerick, Waterford, Cork, and Wexford. And trading with the native Irish started to replace raiding in many places, as happened in England, of course, as well, where permanent settlements were established. Trading was often preferable to raiding. I mean, it could be done without loss or injury, and from that, alliances began to grow. Intermarriage, conversion to Christianity. Some Irish chieftains and their Norse counterparts realizing that there was a mutual advantage of having allies, and similar things were happening in Britain as well, where the divide between Norse and Saxon was often blurred, as alliances were formed for various reasons, people began to intermarry, and so forth. Slaves were an important commodity, especially young women, of course, fit young men who could be put to work, or educated men like priests or monks who'd fetch a very good price in the slave markets of Francia or as far as distant Constantinople, capital of the great Byzantine Empire. Dublin became the largest slave market in Europe, as a matter of fact, under the Norse kings, men like the very famous Ivar the Boneless. And excavations in the city have turned up long iron chains with collars that were used to link a group of slaves together, as well as individual collars that were locked around a slave's neck or ankle, just to make sure they didn't sneak away when nobody was looking. Should we see the Vikings as extra evil for their considerable contribution to slavery? No, not at all, since it was the norm right across Europe and the Middle East at that time, and indeed in every country in the world as well, to greater or lesser extent. The Anglo-Saxons, for example, used slaves. The Vikings simply went where there was profit to be had, and there was great profit to be made from slaves, or good ones at least. The young, the strong, the good-looking, well, they would be taken. The old, the sick, and the ugly would be killed, or usually probably just left where they were. There was no extra advantage in bothering to kill them. That was simply good business practice. And the Middle Eastern slavers who had raided the coast of Africa would have done exactly the same thing for probably centuries before the Vikings got there. Nor did the Vikings treat their captives with this often senseless brutality that marked the European slave ships of the 18th and 19th centuries. Whipping and beating them and frequently letting them starve. Slave ships usually reaching the New World with a lot less, cargo, I suppose we should say, for want of a better word, because that's how the ship's crews would have seen them, than they'd started out with. Dumping badly treated dead slaves overboard wasn't good for profits. But they didn't really seem to see that. So making sure that slaves reached the slave markets alive and in good condition was important to the Vikings. Now, it wasn't a matter of kindness or compassion. They really weren't interested in that. Again, it was simply good business practice, and the Vikings were very good businessmen. And businesswomen, too, for that matter. Norse women were often merchants. We find scales and other indications of trade in graves, so it's unlikely they had anything very much to do with the slave trade. Another important aspect of the Viking expeditions was economic and cultural, something often completely overlooked. The exchange of ideas and knowledge, as well as produce that resulted from it, was immense, and as I say, frequently overlooked in television shows and documentaries and history books which simply go for raiding. It's much more dramatic. I mean, an account of, Ivar shoving his sword through some monk or raping a woman or something. Well, I suppose that's a lot more exciting than bartering over, how many pieces of silver you want for a dozen pigs. No one else at that time travelled over such vast distances as the Norse, sailing into the Mediterranean Sea, raiding and trading across Spain and Italy, reaching North Africa, and trading as far as Constantinople, Baghdad, and even further. They navigated the rivers of Europe, from the Baltic down to the Black Sea, to reach the greatest trading centre in the world, Constantinople. By that route also, as well directly by sea, often having to port their ships overland to change rivers, and that's no fun. Try carrying a ship, it's not an easy job. They established settlements in Britain and Ireland, France, the Orkney, Shetland and Faroe Islands, the Isle of Man, Iceland, Greenland, Russia, Sicily, and they landed in North America 500 years before Columbus didn't, since he never actually even saw the American mainland. He found some islands in the Caribbean, which was not North America. No others achieved such a widespread presence across the world, at a time when most people knew little about the world beyond where they happened to live, many knowing nothing about even what lay in the next country, if indeed they knew there was one, let alone places hundreds of miles away. But the Norse did, and they brought goods and ideas from their own lands to distant ones, returning with similar things from them. They brought furs and animal hides, beautiful jewellery and metalwork in gold and silver, amber, which is common in Northern Europe, but it was quite scarce around the Mediterranean, coloured glass beads and fabrics, as well, of course, as slaves, to the markets of the Middle East and Constantinople, returning with exotic goods and money. Over 200,000 Arab silver coins have been found in Scandinavia, brought back by Norse traders, as well as a ring inscribed to Allah, and goods from as far east as India. And their language left a great impact on Britain and Ireland. There are over 50 words in English that come directly from Old Norse, and in Irish Gaelic too. Quite often they are unchanged. They are exactly the same as they were pronounced 1,000 years ago. 3 areas in Europe even take their names from the Norse. Normandy in France, from Normandy, the Northman's land, as it was known to begin with, and Russia and Belarus, where the Norse were known as the Rus, from a word meaning to row a boat. Not since the Roman Empire had one people extended their influence across such a vast area, nor would anyone else until long after the Viking Age. And even the Romans, though they'd never got further west than Wales, whereas the Vikings, they crossed the Atlantic Ocean. So how should the Vikings be remembered today? Should we see them only as merciless savage killers who plundered and devastated towns and villages? See them only when they went Vikingr? Or should we see them not as the Vikings, leaping off dragon-headed ships beneath the Raven banner, but rather as what they really were, the people of Scandinavia? See them as a highly complex and admirable people, industrious, hard-working, inventive, possessing great skill in building amazing ships, treating women with considerable respect, not shutting them away during their periods as unclean as happened in other places, or basically treating them like cattle in the possessions of men, as so many countries tended to do. Respect them as traders, explorers, settlers, as well as fearsome warriors, whose influence can be felt even to our own time. Perhaps we should see them as both, for that is what they were. Yes, they were cruel and often merciless, but no more so than many others before, during, and after their own time. Their evilness frequently exaggerated to suit the views of the Christian Church, which was only too happy to ignore exactly the same thing done when it was Christians doing the merciless killing and raping and all that sort of thing, which they did quite frequently. But, they were also highly civilized, far ahead of their age in many ways, such as personal hygiene and grooming, for example, washing their hands and faces, combing their hair daily, and bathing once a week, calling the day we know as Saturday Lorgadr, meaning the bath or pool day, while a Saxon might have had 1 bath per year. Well, maybe 2 baths if they were really, clean freaks, really concerned with cleanliness. I'm sure being with a Norseman on a very hot day in a confined space would have been far more pleasant than being with an Anglo-Saxon. Even now, many history documentaries concentrate solely on the raiding aspect of the Vikings, either passing over with a brief mention or ignoring altogether the social and cultural aspects of Norse society, their trading and exploring, farming and building, the extent of their non-violent influence on the world of their day, to say nothing of their influence on us today. The many words in English and Irish, many town names, for example, that come directly from Old Norse. Even with the greater knowledge and understanding that we now have, the Vikings are still frequently seen as nothing more than brutal men sailing in dragon-headed ships looking for helpless villagers to mercilessly slaughter and women to rape, even though we now know better. I have seen any number of TV programs on the Vikings in which there isn't even a passing mention of any non-violent activity, and you'd think that they never planted crops or had domestic animals. They never raised families or created works of art, nor did they ever have sex with any women they hadn't actually abducted beforehand. I find that very irritating. The often extreme brutality of the Roman Empire is never stressed at the expense of the wonderful works of art, the incredible buildings of social order and stability of the Pax Romana, the contributions to civilization made by Rome. I mean, no history documentaries dwell exclusively on Roman military brutality. Yet in the case of the Vikings, it is frequently the opposite. The brutality is the main topic, often the only topic. That is a pity, and it is dreadfully biased. Even in art, they are misrepresented. Depicted with horns sticking out of their helmets, something we may lay, of course, at the feet of Herr Richard Wagner and his operas, the Ring of the Nibelung, for example, whose, in these operas, of course, these were the start of that misconception. Men having horns on their helmets and women, the Valkyria, having wings, without even the slightest historical evidence of any such thing. But costume designers started to do that. It became popular, it caught on, and suddenly, just because of something that was going on an operatic stage in Bayreuth in Germany, all the Vikings had horns on their helmets. It's a very good example of how incorrect information in public media can cause problems, because after all, the operatic stage was public entertainment of its day, just as incorrect television shows and documentaries of today can spread false information. I find the Viking Age to be a fascinating subject, both historically and mythologically. Dragon-headed ships with their sails set and oars splashing in the water as they traverse the rivers and oceans of the known world. Valkyria riding through the sky, bearing dead warriors to Asgard, there to feast with the gods. Shield walls and heroic valor. Farms and settlements with families working for a new life in lands far distant from their own. And yes, burning villages and monasteries as raiders from the north descended on them. It's exciting, it's thrilling, and intriguing and fascinating at the same time. Separating fact from fiction, seeing where something that actually occurred has been altered to suit religious or political ideas of the time, evil deeds exaggerated to make them seem even more evil than they actually were, and often they were evil, and good ones brushed under the biased carpet of history. There's a lot of things actually under that carpet, not just from the Viking Age. As Napoleon famously said, history is written by the victors. So, of course, naturally, what they did was incredibly evil and dreadful and, so horrible. But what we did, well, it was pure and noble and wonderful, even when it was exactly the same thing as what they'd done. But, of course, see, we did it to stop them doing it. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? No, it doesn't, actually. Oh, well. I hope you enjoyed this look at the Viking Raiders, that so popular but greatly magnified image of the Norse people. So, until next time, I shall say farewell, goodbye,